So we all know about the negative effects of microplastics on our health, wildlife, the environment, water, the list goes on. But now there's a new thing to be worried about.
In recent studies, atmospheric scientists have found that all of these microplastics swirling around can actually create ice crystals in clouds more easily than water vapor. And it's because these microplastics can make ice in warmer temperatures by like 20 degrees. And ice crystals make rain and snow. So more microplastics might mean a more increased chance of precipitation.
Awesome. Since clouds are formed by water vapor sticking to dust particles usually, now that there's so much plastic in the atmosphere, water vapor has started to stick to it. And so that means there's just going to be more clouds because there's more matter in the atmosphere, and that leads to more precipitation.
Researchers even found microplastics in cloud samples from a mountaintop in China. This was pretty cool. These researchers basically developed computer models to recreate the journey that microplastic particles took to end up in the clouds. And the study suggested that airflow from nearby, like populated, polluted cities traveled all the way to this remote mountaintop and created microplastic-filled clouds.
So microplastics get released by breaking off of plastic products, so like plastic bags or bottles or food containers, but they also get released from synthetic clothing or paint or carpets or tires or even face scrubs. And then they spread through the air and the water. They've been found all the way at the top of Mount Everest, all the way down to deep ocean trenches. Last year, the world produced 400 million metric tons of plastic, and less than 10% of that is recycled, so the rest will just sit in landfills and produce microplastics.
And just a quick refresher, microplastics are small pieces of plastic about like the size of a pencil eraser that get released in the environment when plastics break down over time through wind or any kind of abrasion or even sun rays, and then they eventually become toxic particles that are just floating around.
So we don't think about when we wash synthetic material in a washer, or even if we just wear a synthetic jacket or something in the sun, that creates microplastics. And a crazy example of how far they've permeated: hurricanes drop 100,000 microplastic particles per square meter of land per day.
Wow. And you might be like, okay, who cares? Like, how does this like affect me? But of the more than 10,000 chemicals that are actually used to make plastic, scientists have identified over 25% of them as potentially toxic.
And that's really scary because the average human inhales the equivalent of a credit card of microplastics every week. And that's not even including how much we take in our food and drinks. 1 liter bottle of water contains 240,000 microplastics.
And because we're constantly ingesting them, they've been found in our lungs, heart, knee and elbow joints, blood, bone marrow, reproductive organs, breast milk, and placentas.
And earlier this year, they were found in the human brain for the first time. In fact, our brains are now 0.5% plastic, which is 30 times more than any other organ.
Yeah, the lead researcher on the study said our brains today are 99.5% brain and the rest is plastic. There's much more plastic in our brains than I ever would have imagined or been comfortable with. I don't know how much more plastic our brain can stuff in it without causing more problems.
I just think plastic and brain together, not a good mix. And it's too early to know what exact impact that plastic will have on our brain function, but it is important to note the brains of people with Alzheimer's and dementia had up to 10 times more plastic than average brains.
The medical community is even forecasting a global health emergency to deal with plastic pollution and how it's affecting our health. What we know for sure is that studies link microplastics in the body to an increased chance of Parkinson's, heart attack, stroke, and even cancer.
Yeah, researchers recently discovered that certain cancer cells spread at an accelerated rate after exposure to microplastics. And now they're looking at whether microplastics could trigger early onset cancer.
Yeah, it's crazy how these are like infiltrating and affecting our bodies. Apparently, our immune systems can attack and kind of get rid of smaller microplastics. But when it comes to larger microplastics that were built to be resilient, our body defenses don't have the proper enzymes to like break them down. So they just kind of hang around in our organs and our blood and disrupt body function, kill cells, and then cause all of these long-term impacts.
And it makes sense because nothing can break down microplastics. And this was interesting. So the bacteria that breaks down organic matter, like wood or food or our bodies or something, hasn't advanced enough to break down plastic because it's such a new substance to the world.
Yeah, plastic isn't made from naturally organic compounds, just these really strong chemical bonds that can never be destroyed. And to your point, this is a relatively new material. The first fully synthetic plastic was invented in 1907.
But it took a while for production to get up and running. So the plastic boom really didn't start until after World War II. And since then, 8 billion tons of plastic has been produced. And looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, like with the bacteria, animals are not hardwired to recognize plastic. It's such a foreign substance to them, which is why they try to eat it and then they get sick or they die because their bodies can't break it down. And now we're seeing that just by existing in their environment, they're ingesting so much plastic.
Yeah, they've been found in basically every kind of animal. According to Stanford research, whales eat up to 10 million pieces of plastic a day. And for the first time, microplastics have actually been found in dolphins' breath. So researchers off the coast of Florida and Louisiana basically caught all of these dolphins and held petri dishes up to their blowholes before releasing these dolphins back and caught their breath and sifted through the particles and found the presence of microplastics.
And these scientists said this is especially worrisome because dolphins have much larger lung capacity and they take deeper breaths than humans do. So they're getting exposed to higher levels of microplastics.
Scientists suspect that wind actually transported these particles from nearby cities to the ocean, which is why dolphins are like inhaling these particles. And they found that the dolphin breath samples were made of polyester. So that's obviously what's used to make clothes. And apparently clothes shed a lot of microplastics when they're washed.
And we don't know a lot about the effects of microplastics on animals, but in lab tests on mice, microplastics cause behavioral changes and reproductive problems, and they can inhibit learning and memory.
But don't worry, it gets worse. There are nanoplastics, which are obviously even smaller than microplastics. They're 1/70th the width of a human hair, and they're just like invisibly floating around.
And there's growing evidence that nanoplastics are even more widespread than microplastics, which to me seems like duh. Like they're tinier, they can get to even more places. So if you're wondering, well then why wasn't your whole piece on nanoplastics if they're actually worse? It's because scientists are just learning how to even detect them. So there's not a lot known about them at this point.
And as hopeless and scary as it all sounds, there are innovative ways that scientists and researchers are kind of working to reduce the amount of microplastics in the atmosphere. Like this was interesting. They're experimenting with making bacteria that can eat and decompose plastic, or making more items out of plastic alternatives like corn that are biodegradable and won't shed microplastics. And that's cheaper to make and produces less waste. Oh, and Wren, tell them about the egg thing.
So engineers at Princeton cooked up a very inventive solution. You're going to get that pun in a second, because they discovered by freeze drying and then incinerating egg whites, you get this aerogel, which is apparently like a kind of porous material. And it can actually remove 99% of micro and nanoplastics from seawater, which is more efficient than typical charcoal-based carbon filters.
Okay, cool. So we just need 90 million eggs floating around in all of the oceans. Great. But governments are taking this issue seriously. California, of course, adopted the first-in-nation approach to reduce microplastics pollution. In September, the California Ocean Protection Council created 22 immediate actions to reduce and manage microplastic pollution to help preserve the state's marine environment.
And then, of course, there's little tweaks that we all can make to lower our exposure to microplastics. Obviously, recycling plastic is a great thing. Stop using single-use plastic that just sheds all over your food. And by the same token, stop using plastic silverware. This is a change that I have made since I learned about the plastic in the brain story. Swap out plastic for metal or glass reusable dishes. Avoid clothing made of synthetic material because that's just going to shed everywhere. And don't microwave your food in plastic.